Let's go live. Kieran, you're going to put in the text if we're live. Okay. So, hello. It's always that moment of knowing if we're live or not. I'm getting a nodding head from Kieran, which is always reassuring. So, hello. Good afternoon, and welcome back to the School of Architecture, Planning and Landscapes Broadcasting Headquarters, which is commonly known as my office on the first floor. We're at Newcastle University in the north of England. I guess we have to do that because we're on the internet, and it's a very big place out there. It's really, really nice to welcome our guests today, and we're going to be joined by artist Leah Millar and artist Rosie Morris, and I'll introduce them in a second. And also we've got at the top of our screen here, Kieran Connolly, who is really the impetus behind today's talk. Kieran runs alongside a couple of colleagues our second year design module in the School of Architecture here. And as part of that module, had an idea of looking at questions of ecology, looking at questions of design and humans and non-humans and how they interact. And as part of that, we've been running a kind of program where we've been asking the students to explore different modes of designing and thinking in relationship to different sites, and exploring how humans and animals and non-humans and materials and maybe rocks interact. And really it was Kieran's idea that we would mark this with a bit of a conversation between a couple of our guest artists who are involved in that program, and that's Leah and Rosie. So thank you very much, Kieran. It's really good.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here, and thank you to Rosie and Leah for joining us, and Ed for you for hosting this. I hope you'll have a nice look at the end at some of the things that have been going on in our cohorts as well as part of this. So yeah, thank you very much.
Fantastic. And we should also say really that we've included this today because we're marking the launch of our climate change and literacy programs here, or the beginning of our climate change and literacy programs at the School of Architecture. And over the next few months, we're going to be looking carefully at how we're engaging with questions of climate and questions of the biosphere and changes to our biosphere, and the relationship of architecture and the building industry to those forms of kind of anthropogenic, human-led change. And within that, we're looking quite closely at what it means to be teaching architecture. And so today we've got a couple of events. First, this conversation, Design Beyond the Human, where we're looking at the question of what it means to think outside of our own boxes, outside of our own kind of feeling and sensing boxes as sort of individual human beings in this, I guess, in a kind of Western mode of thought. And this evening at 6:30, hopefully if any of you are watching and are available to join then, we're going to have the launch of the Newcastle Students Climate Action Network, which is a fantastic group of students from Northumbria and Newcastle universities who are taking a really active lead on rethinking questions of education, questions of climate, and how we rethink our kind of pedagogical approaches to addressing this most pressing and urgent of needs. So do join us for that at 6:30. But it's really exciting to be able to launch this program or launch the beginnings of the program today with Leah and Rosie. And we're going to have a bit of a rambling conversation where we're going to move between some questions of arts practice, some questions of relating and seeing through different eyes. Maybe we'll begin with a question about other forms of object relations, how we might relate to other things. But before we start, I just want to introduce Leah and Rosie. So Leah Millar is a visual artist and a naturalist as well. And she works in film and photography and performance. I think you're currently based in London, aren't you, Leah? But you've had a strong relationship with the Northeast, is that right?
Yeah, I like to think that I've got a limb in a couple of different places, but definitely my heart is largely in Newcastle a lot of the time. I've spent a long time, maybe the guts of the last decade there. I'm very fond of the place, but yeah, 2020, 2021, these years have seen me slightly displaced down to London.
And engaging in different forms of alchemical practice these days as well.
A little bit, yeah.
And we're also joined by Rosie Morris. And Rosie, you're an artist who's currently lives in Newcastle. And Rosie and I have had a lot of conversations around architecture, kind of spatial questions of arts practice. And you've done quite a lot of work here in the city, haven't you, in different architectural environments, looking at how an artist can affect forms of sort of spatial change and develop experiential environments.
Yeah, definitely. Probably too much in Newcastle. I need to get out of Newcastle.
It's a pretty rich ground, really, for some of this work. But Rosie and Leah are both really good friends of the school as well. We're really privileged to be able to work with them. So, as I said, we're kind of beginning this conversation in a way that will maybe help us kind of work through a few questions that relate to the environment, relate to climate. Because one of the big conditions, or one of the big problems, I guess, we're facing, as well as the stuff that we're making and putting out into the world that's causing kind of significant climate change as we understand it, through environmental pollution, through air pollution, through carbon, effects of carbon on global heating. We're also faced with questions of our ideas, because a lot of our practices are driven primarily by how we think. And our thoughts are driven by our kind of ethics and our values. And we often approach things and objects in the world as things that we engage with on our own terms, sometimes more so than we engage with them on their terms. And in that kind of thinking, I was brought to mind, I can't remember where it was, I was trying to find the quote, but there's a philosopher called Graham Harman who writes on object-oriented ontology, which has been doing the rounds in arts practice of late, and has been quite a kind of popular kind of mode of thought, because it sort of decenters the human and it makes the object on a plane. It's a kind of what you would call a flat ontology, which is a rather fancy term for saying that it's a flat mode of looking at the world. There isn't a hierarchy in object-oriented ontology. And I was remembering in there, I'm sure it's Harman, someone will probably prove me wrong on that, but there was a point where he was talking about a rock tumbling down a cliff face and crushing a car as it was driving along a road that was sort of with a rock overhang, and asking the question of whether there is an agency behind the rock that killed the person in the car. And that kind of mode of thinking makes us question whether the stuff that we're in the world with, you know, the objects, whatever they may be, do they contain an agency of their own right? And can we think like a rock? And I know this is something that you're engaged with, thinking about, Leah, how we might have a different approach to thinking. And yeah, how might we think like a rock? Or can we think like a rock? Or can a rock think, I suppose?
It's a lot of questions at once. I think, I'm really interested in this idea of humans' ability or willingness to consider perspectives other than themselves and to consider non-human perspectives, because it's not something that we're conditioned to do. Certainly societally, my understanding of the society that I live in is that I'm encouraged to be individualist and to take what I can get. And I think, in a way, for me, that's always been slightly at odds with how I want to view the world, or, you know, how I grew up, the place where I grew up. And I've always been, maybe to a fault, I've been really quite acutely aware of my own, of what else is around me. And I think my entry to arts practice and certainly to filmmaking came at a point where I was starting to experience an almost disabling notion of how the kind of traces I left on the world. Just, you know, to the point where I didn't want to use toothbrushes because I was consumed by the idea of, like, well, where does it go afterwards? And, you know, I'm consuming all this stuff and leaving all this detritus, and that's gonna, like, leave a mark on the world. And I think once you start to think a little bit like that, then you can maybe consider the idea that, well, you know, everything that's around me could possibly have agency, and what does that mean? You know, what does that mean about my relationships to it? And one of the things I've noticed in the amount of time when I've certainly been willing to conceive of something which, you know, is perhaps slightly irrational to the Western mind, is that there are some things that it's easier to accept might have agency or might have consciousness. Science has been studying the agency of plants. You know, can plants feel? Can they hear? What happens when we play music to them? We know that if we restrict light, things happen. We know that plants respond to touch actually in a negative way most of the time. You know, it's easier for us as humans to consider that a plant or an animal is deserving of more equality, but a rock is viewed as something completely inanimate, which is interesting because rocks actually are in no way inanimate, but they just operate on a much different time scale than we do. Yeah, so it's like, how do you, I think I've been thinking about that a lot in certainly in my practice. How do you create spaces where anyone could come in and actually consider that question? Because by and large, it's really difficult for us to get our head around ideas like this. And I think for me, one of the roles of art is to make spaces for difficult questions or silly ideas, you know. I don't know if that really answers a question about the rock.
Well, it sort of begins part of a conversation around that, I think, because it's really interesting, the idea that the rock might have a kind of rockiness of a way of approaching and appreciating the world that we can't entirely understand, because we appreciate and approach the world very much through our humanness, don't we? You know, we see things as humans. So to try and imagine how a rock perceives the world, we have to imagine it through being a human, imagining how a rock is imagining the world. So it's almost impossible to extract ourselves from that kind of mode of thinking. And there's a paper that I've been reading in preparation for this talk. It's called Those Obscure Objects of Desire. And it's by Andrew Cole. And it talks a bit about this kind of object-oriented way of thinking. But there's a really nice part in towards the end where it quotes from a modernist poet, Marianne Moore, who said that it is human nature to stand in the middle of a thing. I really like that. It is human nature to stand in the middle of a thing. So even when we're trying to encounter a rock, we're sort of standing in the middle of the rock, being a human, trying to look through the rock's eyes. So, you know, in a sense, trying to get away from our own subjectivity and own consciousness is really, really hard. And that kind of way of seeing things differently, I guess, is really crucial. And Harman talks about it as a kind of primitive psyche of the rock. So maybe we understand other kinds of relations, earlier relations in things. And that brings me a little bit to something, Rosie, that we were just chatting about before we started, of how you see the world through different eyes. So we can kind of see the world through a rock's eye, but we're a human seeing it through a rock's eye. What happens when you start seeing it through other humans' eyes, but that are maybe, you know, humans that are that tall? I don't know how tall they are now. That tall. Okay, because they have
10 centimeters tall.
Okay.
Yeah, we were talking. I guess my practice is coming from a want to slow down and to consider space and to be kind of more attuned to all of the, I guess, to the ways of experiencing and sensing spaces and the atmospheres within space. So I kind of would like to create installations where we experience slowing down and almost a meditative experience of being in the here and now of a particular space. But yeah, I was sort of discussing with Ed earlier that I don't really get time for much meditation at the moment. I don't really get time. I have a little 20-month-old son. So I guess, yeah, at one point, I think last year, I was sort of looking at my practice and thinking, is this sort of authentic to be saying this is like what my practice is about right now? And I guess just trying to shift the focus a little bit and to look at kind of what I am seeing through this new kind of lens or experience, I guess. And it's still through my eyes, but I guess I'm kind of very much focused on my son seeing the world and what he's attuned to, and as a little baby being, you know, really interested in contrasts and light on a wall, being totally fascinated by those things. And then I guess just that inquisitive nature and curiosity and energy and kind of activity and wonder, and the pace maybe changes and things can kind of be a bit more playful, or, you know, slightly less serious. So I think I'm kind of, yeah, seeing the merits in that new perspective.
I think that idea of seeing things playfully or curiously or with wonderment is really interesting. And I wonder, has this kind of different or new perspective that you've gained on and sort of through your son's eyes, has that given you a different perspective on seeing your own arts practice and what you've been making or what you have made in the past? Because you talk a bit about, you know, seeing things with a different pace almost, and seeing, you know, being fascinated by light or shade or colour. And it makes me think about a bit of work that you made back in 2015. And are you okay if I just share that now with everybody, and then we can talk a little bit about this, because I think it's really interesting in relationship to what you've just spoken about. So as we were talking at the introduction, Rosie is, I guess you work across sort of multiple different media, don't you, Rosie? And one of them is, I guess, sort of film in spaces, film in architectural spaces. And the piece here that I'll share screen now, let's get that up, is called 55 Westgate Road. And maybe you could just briefly introduce it for us, Rosie.
Okay, so this was, like I'd said, back in 2015. I was kind of doing, I guess, a 2-week residency, just sort of being in this particular environment on Westgate Road in Newcastle in the northeast of England, which is an abandoned site. It's to me a very interesting site. It's kind of got lots of layers of like there's at least 2 facades on the outside kind of front, and you can see the traces of the kind of inhabitants within it. And yeah, I was really interested in kind of seeing this space as an animated space, or kind of how the light really animated it and kind of brought it to life, and how that showed the life within it, like, I guess, non-human life, and the kind of cobwebs, the dust, the detritus, the non-green nature, but also kind of the lives and the stories and voices that it held, and continued to kind of, you know, it continues from now.
So we're just going to watch just about 50 seconds or a minute worth of a clip of this. There's something really beautiful about the way that the light picks out the kind of architectural details as it moves through, isn't there? And obviously there's a speeding up of the light as it moves into and kind of tracks around the sky dome and moves into the building there. But I wonder if could you tell us a bit about what the sound is doing as well in that space? Because how it in a sense is helping us to pay attention or to attend to that environment, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, the sounds by Sam Grant, who's a musician and sound engineer and artist based in Newcastle. And I kind of asked Sam, well, to be honest, he'd got a really fantastic piece of sound that I wanted to borrow, but I asked him to kind of work with that and kind of, so the film starts actually with quite a cityscape of sounds and the kind of passing cars outside the building, and that idea of that psychological kind of placement within the kind of broader context, and then gradually the kind of tonal sound, which I can't remember, it was a few years ago, I feel like it was something to do with microphones on magnets. Anyway, it's got this kind of hum or this sort of tonal noise which sort of shifts, and it's very kind of minimal, but also over time really does kind of wander and meander. And I think often sound is really important, particularly when used within space as a kind of a way of almost thickening the void and acting like a kind of glue within the space. I'm really interested in its ability to do that and to make us really aware of the tangibility of the nothing. And kind of projects I've worked on in the past, not particularly with this one, but with other projects working with kind of resonance recording, they can really bring to life and really kind of make physical this sort of nothingness of the void, this atmosphere, which I think is really kind of interesting and important as a way to sort of reach out. And you mentioned like the surfaces there and how we kind of almost have this haptic knowledge of a surface and we can sort of feel it through looking, but I think also the sound and the texture and the timbre of that sound says so much about you know, the movements through a space, the surfaces, the kind of qualities of that and how that feels, and also kind of how that lands with us emotionally in terms of our kind of memory as well, and yeah, nostalgia and all of those other things that it taps into.
I think there's something really beautiful there, the no-thingness of the void. I think that's really interesting. Maybe we'll return to that at the end. But there's evidently something you do there as well in it, that somehow through speeding up the time that we experience the light moving into the space, you slow down our appreciation of it too, and we're able to attend to that space in a very different way. So there's a kind of curious relationship there between both the kind of acceleration of time, but then a real focusing and slowing of attention. And I really enjoy that. And I kind of observe, maybe it's just me observing it, but you know, trying to make connections here in the talk between a piece of work that you made back in 2017, I think it was, Leah. Is that right? Unseen? I think it was 2017.
Yeah.
Was it
2018?
2018.
Yeah.
It's a piece of work that looked at the post-industrial landscape of the River Tyne here in Newcastle. And within that, sound and your photographic, your filmic technique play a really important role in slowing down our encounter with that river edge, the riverine edge, as you talk about. And it's interesting to see this because both Rosie and I went and saw this together. We suddenly remembered the other day. We went down, didn't we, to the side gallery, which is down by the river. And for those guys watching at home, it's a really significant photographic and filmic gallery and cinema as part of the Amber Collective. That when things reopen is really worth going and looking at and engaging with the archive there. You know, it's sort of a really significant documentary photography. But yeah, I wonder if we could play a little bit of an introduction of that and just kind of look at a few of those connections because they both strike me as ways of approaching things with a different, what we might call a temporality, a different kind of time frame of looking. So I'm just going to play the opening sequence of this. Let's get my screen share working again. Hopefully that is working okay for people. Yeah. So I guess, I mean, within the very title, you know, you're talking about time, aren't you, in that, and different markers of time, very kind of human markers of time, but time marked at a much greater expanse as well. And you were working with sound artist Tim Shaw. Is that where this?
Yeah, I was really fortunate to be able to work with Tim on this project, who understood what I was looking for, which was, in effect, I was looking for what was there in absence. I'm very drawn to rivers in general, but was interested in the fact that this was an area that I would sort of pad around on my daily run, and I just didn't, you know, for years, and I really didn't know anything about it. I was aware that there were a lot of conversations about the development of the riverside, but I really wanted to explore the sites that were now viewed as derelict, but also seemed to have a lot going on in them. So Tim was a really great person to work with because he understood my own process, which is very slow, and involves really using the camera as a device to direct my own view. It's a way of looking at something and creating a frame so that I can really see a subject without all of the noise which is constantly bombarding humans, you know, through sight on a daily basis. And Tim was able to listen to what I was kind of interested in looking at and translate that into what we could pick up sound wise. So we had a lot of fun. I'd been, you know, chucking bits of film into the river and burying them in mud, and we had a lot of fun with kind of hydrophone microphones that we could put underwater, and using different kinds of manipulation of sound to get specific resonances of things that wouldn't ordinarily be audible to the human ear. So the film is interesting to me because the sound is completely wild, nothing is synced to the image, but somehow it manages to root us in the space.
Yeah, it does very much. I mean, being myself very familiar with this stretch of the river, it really resonates with my understanding of being down there, you know, being alongside that part. And it strikes me the really nice connection to what Rosie was just talking about there, that what you're saying is what was there in absence, in a sense, is, you know, similar to kind of talking about the no thing in the void, isn't it? You know, how do you find what is absent in something? And in many senses, that's a really big question that potentially we'll be engaging with more as the years go by, as we lose more things, we lose more beings in the world, we lose more of our kind of non-human kin as well, and we lose environments, and we lose habitats. How we connect to that absence of something. And so you were saying that sound was a really important practice in there, was it? And in terms of trying to encounter that absence?
Well, I think you know, to me, sound and image are, they're really linked. I mean, there's that Robert Bresson quote about the eye seeing but the ear imagining, and I think that's so beautifully put as a way of sound can unlock what we can't see in an image, and it allows us to imagine and to conceive of things that aren't visible and or are perhaps lost. And I think sound and image working together have that incredible effect of activating memory. The idea of directly engaging with our senses and then unlocking sensate memories that we hold in our bodies. And I think that's the principal reason that I've chosen to work with moving image in the way that I have. So for me, the idea of being able to look at spaces where you can't really see what you're looking for, or, you know, asking a question of spaces is very complex, but it's important to keep doing, and it's a really profound way of interacting with sight through an arts practice, I think.
I think there's something something about sound that gives you a kind of intimate encounter with something, because it's, you know, it's literally the kind of, as my friend Neil put it, it's the movement of air that can make you cry. You know, it's quite extraordinary, isn't it? You know, you hear a piece of sound or a voice or something, and the resonance of it, just this subtle movement of air particles, can make you cry, or it can induce an emotional affect. You know, it can induce an emotional change. And there's something really intimate about sound in that respect. And I guess then, with kind of coupled with images that both of you have been working on, you know, the way that you combine that as an approach generates a sort of an environmental experience, I guess you might call it. There's a kind of, there's a bringing together, isn't there, of things in that. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about the practice of the filmmaking here, Leah, because it's quite, I guess for a lot of us today, it's quite an unconventional film practice, isn't it? You didn't go down there with your iPhone and, you know, quickly whip along the site and then, you know, download it as an MP4, right? It's a much more involved process that in some senses also encountered the material realities of that site. Is that true?
Yeah, I mean, I do work with digital film and digital technology as an intermediary, but I've always chosen to work with photochemical film as my first starting point with any piece that I'm making. And I think one of the reasons for that is because I like it, and my method of working is quite slow, and it's easier for me to hold something in my hand and understand it than it is to look at it on a screen. I think there's something about, as I said before, about slowing down and being in contact with the material technology of image making, which allows us to think quite deeply about what it is that we're actually doing there and what we're looking at, and maybe for me making a bit of more of a connection with it, certainly in terms of just the way I'm thinking. What the industry of image making is doing at the minute is making a very flat, hyper real image that we feel is very reflective of our real life, but it doesn't have, it's kind of it's a bit of a dream, you know, and it doesn't have many points of contact or connection. In fact, the kind of image making we see in high definition that we're consuming through streaming platforms and even in the cinema now is so smooth that it's very difficult to feel a connection to it other than in your imagination. Whereas with one of the things I like about film is that it allows us to feel a tactile or haptic connection of touch, because we can understand texture, we can perceive glitches. It's not always very smooth. You can see bits of dirt sometimes. And that's true of sound as well, of analog sound as well. You can appreciate, as Rosie said, texture and timbre in a way that is quite different to the digital or electronic signals that can be produced. So I think that's one of the reasons. And in making the film at the site on the river, it was important to me that the film itself was in some way part of the work, its materiality, and film as a substance is composed of layers which can be played with to create different types of imagery. You can scratch film, you can make it dirty, you can ruin it really, really quickly. So some of the 16mm film that had been shot at the site was then buried or interred in the mud on the river banks for a period of time. Some of it was left in the water, and then the effects of the environment, the tiny bits of the film surface being eaten away, that could then be both heard and seen. So that was something that became part of the fabric of the film. So the actual the actual site and the non-human elements of what were there, tiny little bugs and heavy metals, have had an implication on the image that comes out in the final film.
Yeah, and I think that absent, or that the presence of touch or the tactile that you talk about in there feels, you know, ever so poignant in these moments when, what, you know, that so many of our encounters are over this sort of technical digital image interface that we have. But again, another thing that really strikes me about your description of your work is the idea of slowing down there, and slowing down as a way of attending to something. And it's a really nice term that another kind of artist friend of the schools, and of you guys, I guess, as well, Tess Denman Cleaver introduced me to, was this idea of attending to something, of spending time with a thing. And I guess there's a, you know, really nice way that your work attends to that bank of the river, and its qualities, both through vision and sound, that allows us to slow into it and sort of experience it as a meditative space or a meditative object when we have greater attention, greater awareness of a thing. And I know this is something, Rosie, that you were working on quite a lot in maybe your sort of most recent large-scale installation work. That if I can just share a picture of that as well. Here. Yeah. And this nicely also, I didn't realize, but also seems to incorporate film into it too. I can see the ghostly silhouette of a projector.
Was that the night with Guy Sherwin, Rosie?
Yeah, that was the night with Guy Sherwin. That was like a one-off performance night, but it was pretty, well, I thought it was magic.
It was incredible.
Yeah.
So this was a work in the Lane Gallery, and also, was it in 2017 or 2016? I can't recall.
It like just bridged just into 2017 in the January, so I say both.
Both.
Yeah.
But the meditative experience in here is really crucial, isn't it? And as a way of encountering space, quite different to our normal encounters with space, or our everyday encounters with space, which can often be rushing through, you know, speeding by, not attending to, not encountering slowly.
Yeah.
Part of what you were doing here was a kind of a slowing into space, wasn't it? A deeper meditation within the gallery environment.
Yeah, and like you say, trying to hold us in that space. I was really conscious. I mean, when I work with a particular space, I do a lot of research, but also just, you know, walk into that space. And coming from the city in Newcastle town centre, this is the Land Gallery in Newcastle. So you come from like quite a bustling city centre. You kind of go through this quite ornate kind of Edwardian gallery design, which is sort of designed to be, you know, very high vaulted ceilings, meant to kind of make you feel impressed by the sublime experience of viewing art. And then you go through this kind of pre-Raphaelite room, so it's very kind of picture heavy. I think next door to it there was an Alice in Wonderland exhibition, which was again like pretty fast paced, and you know, into this space, and I kind of wanted it to be a bit of a relief space, or a place that you could just be and I guess sort of soak it up. And there's this sort of text there that you're kind of scrolling through the images, but that was almost trying to look at, you know, how we behave and experience a gallery environment. And for me, sometimes that's you know, quite uncomfortable. I feel like I'm put on the spot, I'm a performer, I'm framed within white walls. I think a lot of people feel like they're not quite sure what to think or say, and you have to whisper, and it's almost like the kind of library environment of feeling like you're going to get told off or you can't touch anything. And I guess researching that the Lang space is, you know, the history of Edwardian gallery spaces when the Lang was built. You could go and have a picnic in a gallery space, which sort of feels crazy now. And that kind of being potentially far more social or far more kind of relaxed. So I think I wanted to sort of create a point of contrast to the spaces around it, and also to create something in the city centre which was, like you said, a meditative environment to sort of stop and to slow down and to appreciate being in this space. You know, there's no windows, you're not looking out, you're kind of held in it. And the paintings on the walls are sort of almost a slightly humorous, I'm going to paint the walls in the space, I'm going to reflect the space and just sort of hold you in this nothingness, if that makes sense.
Well, Well, and I was going to ask you about your practice in here, because you know, another one of your kind of many hats is you're a very talented painter, and the installation was composed of these Trompe l'oeil type paintings, you know, these paintings that almost pretended to be spatial in their own right. You can see them here on the screen as they sort of descended, and the effect, again, having been in the space, the effect was really quite striking to change my whole relationship with the gallery. And one thing when we were chatting about this before as a kind of three that struck me was something you said, Leah, was that you can't see the Leng anymore but through Rosie's work, which is, there's a really nice way that you've quite dramatically affected a gallery perception, even when your work's not there. And I wonder, was that an intent behind the practice to leave a kind of memory of that space imprinted on people's retinas, I guess, when they left?
I feel like that would be very, no, that would be very, no, that's really lovely of you both to say. I mean, I think it's fantastic and like amazing, and I really love that. I feel like that would have been a very big-headed intent. But it's great that it, you know, like you were saying, some of that kind of resonance maybe, or that kind of emotive feeling that you can get away, or that memory can be held by a space, and you know, still potentially create an area for kind of calmness or meditation or kind of just being. And that's really lovely to know.
How did you do the work? What was the practice behind the...
So it's not entirely, so it is three-dimensional. I think it's like 23 meters long, this space, so it's kind of huge. And a lot of my work tries to deconstruct, or just sort of, I guess, physically disorientate us or subvert us from what we're seeing, but by borrowing from what was there. So kind of brings this curve of the ceiling down through to the floor, so that curve is real at the bottom. And then I think there are 56 8x4 sheets of MDF that I created this painting on, which was a kind of, like you said, a perspectival morphing of the shadows that you can't see in this photo, but which are on the ceilings, kind of what were lights at the top. And by sort of perspectival morphing, I mean it's sort of stretched out, and from one position it makes sense, but as you walk and move around the space, it sort of stops making sense, or kind of reveals the illusion. And I kind of really like that it makes you aware of the falsity, question reality, aware of your active involvement in viewing. But I guess how I did it, the work is a painting and a build-up of really, really thin layers of paint, hoping that the lights in the space could kind of, so I think it starts with blue, and there's a lot of layers of blue, and to shift the tonal value, and then I think there's a yellow, and then a red, and then a white. So hopefully some of those colours kind of, there was quite low lighting in the space, kind of are emitted from it, if that makes sense. It's really hard to photograph, but hopefully, yeah, hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And part of the experience was going in this expanse of carpet, wasn't it? So you very much intended for people to dwell within this gallery space for a while, and to spend some time in it, and to partake in it as an environment that consciously slowed the experience of that space.
Yeah, and a lot of people in the visitors book, I think, had just gone in and took their shoes off and just lay in there. And like a lot of people, it was really lovely that people had, you know, really enjoyed and just chilled out in the space. It's great.
Really wonderful. One thing, I'm just going to stop sharing on that for a moment. One thing that again kind of strikes me about your description of the history and the use of the space is the way that it contains different appreciations and understandings of what you might do there, you know, the kind of social habits, the acts that take place. And it links, or it brings me to kind of thinking about a current project you're involved with, Leah, or you're kind of developing. This is this site at Royston Cave, and what you talk about as sites and spaces as repositories of knowledge. I find that really interesting, that a place can actually hold a kind of form of knowledge. Now, I guess you see it in the Leng quite in in a kind of social sense, that there are certain sets of behaviors that a space encourages you to do or to hold. But then there are also sort of mythical, historical knowledges, aren't there, that are held within space. And I'm just going to, I hope it's all right to share this, because this is I found this really fascinating. What I found on the Royston Caves website, which is this interactive 3D cave model.
Oh yeah, it's great. They've just put that up recently.
Do you want to tell us a bit about the cave, Leah? Because it's absolutely incredible.
Yeah, so this is a site that I've been working with in collaboration with another artist, Marcus Coates, who's someone I've had a collaborative practice with for a few years. And we are working with this site as part of a project called New Geographies, where people in the east of England were invited to nominate landmarks or sites which they felt were in some way unsung or unknown about. And one of these was this cave, the Royston Cave, which we've ended up working with, and we chose to work with. It's a bell-shaped cave, which is just underneath a high street, a busy high street in a town called Royston, which is not far from Cambridge. It was discovered in the early 1700s, I believe, and not much is known definitely about its origins. It's very heavily carved. A lot of the carvings have religious symbolism, or there's some pagan symbolism in it as well. It's quite a spectacular place to visit, and it's quite an incredible room to stand in the center of as a human. And I guess this is one type of rock which you could think of as definitely having some knowledge in it, because it's covered in it, and it would appear that it has been a site of significance for certainly some individuals over the course of history. But we don't know specifically what they were doing there, or why. And it was interesting to me because I guess a little bit like Rosie, I've been interested in sort of querying the idea of, even of art as a practice. It's difficult for me sometimes to think of myself as an artist who makes something which hangs on a wall, which people are supposed to go and have a look at and be very well behaved and take instruction from what I've given them on a blank, on a screen on a wall in a white room. For me, I prefer to think of films as spaces to try and deconstruct a little bit about how you're supposed to behave when watching or receiving information. And I like to think of the idea that you could make a film that is a space where people can think about things. And this site is interesting to me because it's a bit of an enigma. So at the minute, I'm working with, as I said, Marcus Coates, and we are making a film about this cave and about the relationships formed between it and a group of people in the town, because it was interesting to me to think about a cave such as this, or any site, a piece of land, or a rock formation, a mountain, as a repository of knowledge, like you said. And I guess here with Royston Cave, there's a lot of information that's evident there, but it could be that you're in the borders of Scotland and you're standing on a piece of land where there have been battles fought, or border disputes. And isn't it interesting to think that the land might retain some of that knowledge, some of those difficulties, the interactions that we as humans have have played with it, and you could see that in a purely sort of spiritual way, but you could also see it in the way that, you know, we leave things, we leave detritus, you know, we leave bits of our bodies when we die. You know, limestone formation, as you were talking about earlier with me, is out of, you know, the dead bodies of tiny creatures. So I don't think it's terribly irrational to think that pieces of rock and land could be repositories of knowledge. It might just be that we need a different way of interpreting them, and that's what the project at Royston Cave is really about.
I think that's a really nice way of sort of bringing the conversation back around full circle, in a sense, isn't it? Because we kind of began by asking that question of whether a rock holds agency, or whether a rock even kind of holds a sense of consciousness. And you know, one of the kind of perspectives from some sort of philosophical interrogations suggests that it has an agency of its own right. A rocky kind of agency, as we spoke about at the beginning. But I suppose the thing that some critiques of that way of thinking about objects has and suggests is that it misses out what you were just speaking about there, Leah, that's so important. And I guess this is so related to your work as well, Rosie, is the relational, you know, the relations between things. So the relations between us as humans, between each other, between us and other sentient beings, and us and other beings, other objects that might have other forms of consciousness, is really crucial to understanding our position in the world and understanding our kind of relationship to how we might kind of hold things, or might have more of a, how might you term it, a kind of ethical responsibility, I guess, for our agency in the world and for what we do here. So there's a really nice way that you could kind of think about your work in this cave, as well as exploring both what the object does, you know, the thinginess of it, the rockiness of the cave, the scratchings, the markings, but also all the relations that went to building this, all the myth, all the kind of construction of knowledge that's located in this place. It gets kind of deeply buried over time. So I think it's a kind of really nice way of bringing back what I've maybe have tried to kind of map out and think in my head as a connection between your work, or certainly a way that maybe work that we might, and I don't want to term this as what your work is, it should be for you to determine, but for work that I would see as kind of having an ecological imperative or an ecological condition, work that might be, you know, speaking to how we live and how we attend to the world, how we hold the world, is that there's a kind of an intimacy that comes from perceptions, and that intimacy is really important to construct through the practice. And I think this is really relevant to what we do as architects, actually, for, you know, anyone that's sort of still listening out there on YouTube from the school, is that I guess as architects we work to create spaces that hold, don't we? And that create intimacy between us, between the objects we sit in. You know, I've been intimately connected to the chair in my office for months now. Like, it's the closest thing to me in the world. And I think about my relationship to objects. You know, we build an intimacy with them. And through building that intimacy, we start to break down what we might see as a kind of rigid connection, a rigid distinction, between us and other, self and other, which in a sense is a bit of an artificial boundary anyway. And I guess that kind of comes back around to a question of then, well, what do we do? So we have a knowledge, we have an awareness that we have a kind of responsibility in the world as people that practice in it, and maybe people in architecture who might go on to manipulate large quantities of material to make things, and certainly as artists who work with ideas, processes and matter to construct kind of new things in the world. Those new things will go on to have effects, right? What we do always has effects. It has relations and conditions, and they spiral out, you know, they produce other things. And a lot of the trouble we're in now is because of the stuff that's happened 400 or 500 years ago, and increasingly, you know, up to date, up to this point now, all the conditions we've put in place. And one of the things that I've been reading, and Leah has as well, I think Robert Macfarlane, brilliant book, highly recommended, Wonderland, talks about how maybe in sort of Western worldviews, we've had a position where we haven't necessarily thought of ourselves as ancestors. That's a curious way of thinking, isn't it? But actually we are ancestors. We are, you know, other beings, other peoples, other things, ancestors. And one thing Robert Macfarlane, I think, asks towards the end of the book is if we recognize ourselves as ancestors and what we do now as having effects on the future, how might we be good ancestors for the future? What might we do? I know this is a terribly hard question to put you both on the spot and ask, but I just wonder, reflecting as very attentive practitioners, people that sit with an intimacy and a kind of connection to place, what might you bring to the world to be a good ancestor?
You want to go first, Leah?
Well, it's a difficult question. I mean, I'm kind of helped by the fact that I'm Northern Irish, and I've already got an inherent sense of like inbuilt guilt, which I've managed to displace to feeling sort of responsible for my environment rather than, you know, just religion and things like that. But I mean, honestly, I just think that as humans, we need to learn to tread lightly, much more lightly than we have been. And I don't think that I don't think that it's easy for us as a species, for whatever reason, to think beyond the immediate and to think about the future. We seem to be consumed by short-termism. Capitalism and neoliberalism haven't helped that. And it is a real challenge for people growing up now. And I think it's really amazing to see the conceptual shift that we have seen, the sense of environmental responsibility that has been emerging in the last few years, is so at odds with what my generation grew up expecting. In terms of me as a person, and as an artist, I do feel guilty because I don't do enough. You know, I recycle. I try to consume less and to be careful about what I consume. But I think that what I can do, what I know I can do, and what I'll try to do is, sorry, I hear my dog yawning there. He's definitely saying wrap it up. I think what I try to do is to create work which may not, it's, you know, I'm always going to be striving to do better and to make better work. I know, Dylan, it's I'm not being very snappy, but I want to create work that can open up the possibility of ideas people being able to sit with ideas, because it's not easy for any of us. I know that I've talked about making work that's slower and more meditative, but there's a lot of things that are jostling for my attention, and it's very difficult to sit with work and to sit with ideas. It's very difficult to stay with the trouble, as someone whose name I can't remember.
Donna Haraway, I think. Donna
Haraway, yeah, it's very difficult to stay with the trouble. But maybe just being able to create work that allows for that possibility is something we can do.
Yeah, I mean, that's really beautifully. I think we were talking before when you sprung it on us that you were going to ask us a question.
It is a hard question. I do apologise for springing it on.
No, but I totally agree with you. I think there's like a real connection between both mine and Leah's work. That is, Leah said this. She was talking about her work wanting to make us consider our place in the world. And whilst my work's kind of not explicitly kind of environmental, perhaps, talking about ecologies is all about connection, and we've talked before, Ed, about Timothy Morton's ideas of enmeshment and things being connected. And I guess sort of, yeah, as an artist, I want to make work that helps people see those connections and see that kind of enmeshment and consider the broader kind of structures and spaces around us, and that, you know, I think you talked at the beginning about us being at the center. You said the human kind of nature is kind of being at the center of a thing, and always makes me think of, you know, this idea of us being the nucleus And a lot of the ideas I've kind of looked at in the past have been about us being kind of the nucleus of this kind of space around us. And I guess that's where the stickiness comes in, and trying to connect and to also imagine the sort of psychological spaces outside of that. And then there's the practical side. I'm really aware at the moment of my work being materials heavy and trying to recycle works that I make, but also does it need to be materials heavy? Are there other ways? Projection and light and all of those things, and actually kind of researching where things come from, the environmental sustainability of materials, and planning that from the outset. I think it feels like it's really important to me at the moment, just from a practical side of things. Yeah. And then also what comes next. I'm a parent now. I need to pass something on to the next.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Rosie and Leah. It's been a real honour, a real privilege to talk about your work with you both. So this kind of concludes the conversation part of today. So thank you to those that have stayed with us and watched. We're going to have a little moment now, and I'm going to invite Kieran to rematerialise himself. And there he is, sat in the background. Kieran, if you've got YouTube on, pause the sound and come back to us with your Kieran-iness. And so we've got an opportunity now for anybody who wants to stay and have a look to share some of the work that Stage 2 have been doing. And if anybody has any questions around that or any comments, if you want to put that into the YouTube chat, then we can feedback on that. Kieran, did you want to share some of the?
Yeah. Do you want to share the screen with it, or do you want me to? Would you?
Yeah, if you're able to. Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah, I can bring that up. Before we go, a few questions come in, or a few comments maybe, before we move on to that. So just a general comment there: we can be good ancestors by seizing the means of production for future generations. Quite powerful, quite statementful there.
I like that. Well spoken as well through your mouthpiece, Kieran. good Marxist comment there.
And then a really interesting, I guess, comment and part question as well, on the subject of void and empty space in architectural space is actually very interesting and well discussed. But also, I think the question here coming around the idea of nostalgia as well, and around what are the causes of nostalgia potentially. What thing, I guess, when we were talking particularly around Rosie in your piece around the sort of the resonance that the space had, and kind of an empty space around it, also potentially feelings of nostalgia. So I don't know whether it's a question or a comment, but it's just
yeah, it feels like a tricky question. What are the causes? Is that right? What are the causes of nostalgia?
Yeah,
that's a big one.
The big one.
Yeah, we could get into all sorts. I think there's a lot to do with different forms of perception as well. Smells as well as sounds, and kind of the acoustics of a space. I guess everyone's individual memories. That particular space was really kind of amazing for kind of the layers of wallpaper. You could kind of look back over the different tastes that people would have had, over the years. But that's kind of not necessarily in the void.
We're live on YouTube, Juliet.
This is a wonderful discussion about
it is art practice.
Sustainability.
Yes, this is.
See how I've got my mask on like I'm a good girl.
You have.
I'll leave you alone.
See ya. Excellent. That was Juliet, our head of school, being very, very safe.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Excellent interruption. And you also, there's lots of great thank yous as well to Rosie and Leah, and I really enjoyed the talks. There's a lot of really positive things in there. Really fascinating talking about Decade. That as well is really great to have you both come and talk about your practices and their crossovers. I think really into what we do as architects and what we try and do at the school as well. And Dylan's enjoyed it too.
Dylan wants to say something.
Yeah, Dylan, mate.
He's just moaning and groaning quite a lot. I think he wants lunch.
He's gorgeous. Thank you both for having us. It's been really nice to hear more about Leah's work as well. I've really enjoyed that.
I've adored seeing circles are slices of spheres again. It's really lovely to be reminded of that time. And thank you so much for the discussion. It's been good because these aren't always things that we talk about a lot. They're in the background, but it's really good to be reminded of how important they are.
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you.
So one of the things as part of this was a little virtual exhibition we've done for a couple of our years in the undergraduate, both second year and third year on our BA architecture program. Have been really working with materials and thinking through making in two different capacities, really, and related to their work and their projects. And really starting to attend perhaps more in our stage 2 on to questions around designing beyond the human, which the title of this talk comes from, and which Rosie and Leah were involved in. They kind of helped us out and gave us some really amazing sort of tutorial support and guidance to our students in stage 2, along with Paul Merrick, Testen and Cleaver, Joe Shaw, Catherine Bertela and Emily Speed. So it's kind of a thank you to all of those. And that the work is actually really interesting, I think. I'm bringing it up on screen at the moment. Just bear with me because I don't want to bring up YouTube.
No, bring up YouTube. All sorts
so kind of on a puppet exhibition here, we can kind of see a range of examples about tending to the habitats of humans and a range of different practices as well. Are
you screen sharing there, Kieran?
I am, yeah. Can you not see it?
No.
Oh, I can.
Okay, that's fine. It's just me.
It's you then, Ed. I won't dare look at my YouTube, so hopefully you can see it as well. But a whole range of different approaches, from collage practices, video pieces, soundscapes, working with materials. I think what's really interesting in this as well is how resourceful all of you been, you might be watching, and all of our students have been in trying to think through how they can build more empathy with their non-humans, see through the lens of non-human users for a range of animals and organisms, and also use materials that come to hand. So some amazing sort of pieces of caramel, making sugar, kind of reusing and recycling and reclaiming bits of material as well. I think there's a real variety of work on show here. And then likewise in our graduating year, the undergraduate in third year, there's a range of really amazing work related to their current year-long design projects, exploring how practices of making can inform the way in which they approach designing their buildings. And actually, I think what's really impressive across both years is we're working in times where we've been mostly rooted to our screens. I think, as Ed said, rooted to our chairs and our screens. And actually that ability, I think, Leah, you were saying to hold something in your hand, to hold material and understand it, is so fundamental and something we can't lose sight of, I think. When hopefully we can start to return to slight sense of normality. And the fact that we need to know what it is we make with what it is we build with in architecture. And I think that's what really these exercises attempt to do, these kind of exhibitions and these pieces that our students make, is to understand really how we make and why we make. And so it's a great set of work really on show in a variety of different things, exploring lots and lots of different materials and ways and practices of making. So I think it's really inspiring work, and well done to all of you who've done that, and thank you to people who've contributed.
Really nice to see. Thank you.
So
Yeah.
You can share that with us as well, can't you, Kieran? Those Padlets.
Yes, we can share them on there so you can see them, and then everyone else can have a look.
Great. I think what you've said about at this moment being able to, we have had this period where we've been really conditioned to everything being on a screen, and we now have this moment to, before hopefully things start to open up and we can occupy more physical space and be building and doing things more in the physical realm. It's really important that we do have this moment of thinking and considering what that will mean. And I thought this project was great for allowing the students to have that opportunity.
To engage with those intimacies as well, beyond Ed's chair, to like the things that we touch and we feel, and those kind of decisions we make whilst we're kind of playing materials that we don't realise, and you don't need to overthink and just play through. I think that's really, really nice to see as kind of the projects that we were working on with you guys have evolved, and also in the final year students' work. That's really brilliant.
I was really struck by the students' willingness and ability to step outside of their own, you know, their own kind of day-to-day lives, and to consider the perspective of other entities. I was really encouraged by that. I thought it was great.
Yeah, echo that completely. And point of view, and like Ed was saying, we can only kind of see it from our human lens, but we can try and at least embody that other point of view, and that's a start, hopefully, of decentering a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, fantastic, guys. I think we might call it a day then, if that's all right. So thanks so much to Leah and Rosie for joining us for the conversation. Thanks, Kieran, for setting it up, and thanks to all the students for contributing the work. I think it's looking fantastic. And do come along. So this evening, 6:30, again live on YouTube. It should be shared on all of our social media channels. Come to the launch of the Newcastle Climate Action Network, which is that student network that is really kind of leading on how we can start rethinking our relationship to teaching and making architecture, I guess. Fab. Well, I'm going to end the stream there. But thank you so much.
Thanks for having us.
You.
Yeah, thank you.